Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of my contemporaries and my generation have taken to the streets in order to protest what they perceive as abuses within the financial services industry and the broader economy. This is the so-called Occupy movement. It started with occupying Wall Street, and now it seems these protesters are occupying cities throughout the Western world. I'm going to present a nuanced critique of the Occupy protests, in that while I find certain aspects and certain motivations of the protests sympathetic, I also have strong disagreements with a lot of what the protesters are advocating, and I think it's ultimately deeply counterproductive to implement many of the solutions that are being touted on the streets right now. To deflect some personal accusations that might be leveled at me from the onset, I want to say that I am not an apologist for the status quo. I do not have any sort of vested interest in the existing system as it is. I am not within the top 1% economically by any metric. In the United States, I may be within the top 40%, which is pretty decent, but it's still not within the demographic that these protesters are targeting. Furthermore, I am not pro-establishment. In fact, I've been critical of the present establishment, be it in the United States or anywhere else in the world, ever since I had the ability to criticize. So, I do not want to be labeled as one of the enemies, one of the caricatured foes of this movement. Indeed, I think that a lot of the grievances of the protesters arise out of legitimate, unfair practices that have been dealt upon them. Many of them are rightly infuriated over the bank bailouts of 2008. The fact is, politically connected gargantuan financial institutions have engaged in dubious lending practices and speculative risk-taking, and when those practices blew up in their faces, instead of absorbing the losses, or perhaps being allowed to fail, and having a more competent competitor or alternative economic arrangement come in to fill the vacuum, these institutions lobbied for and received bailouts at taxpayer expense. This is clearly unjust, it is clearly unacceptable, but it is also clearly contrary to the principles of a free market economy. A free market economy is a profit and loss system. It is a system where each individual and each business is ultimately accountable for its own decisions, whether it makes a good investment or a terrible investment. If it makes a good investment, it has the right to earn the profits from that investment and to keep those profits. If it makes a bad investment, then it must absorb the losses. And if it must fail because of the magnitude of those losses, then so be it. It could, of course, rely on charity from private parties to prop it up, but that's at the discretion of other individuals or businesses. It is not at the discretion of any governmental agency disposing of taxpayer funds. So I agree 100% that these bailouts were completely unjust, and indeed there was a double standard in the way the US federal government applied them, in the sense that there was a bailout for the institutions that had powerful lobbyists to advocate for themselves, and there was no bailout for homeowners. There was no bailout for the millions of Americans who became unemployed as a result of the recklessness of some of these institutions. I do think the protesters need to look a bit deeper into the underlying economic causes of this crisis. They need to pay attention to Austrian economics and the writings of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. These writings, if you study them carefully and you understand Austrian business cycle theory, were prescient about the current economic crisis. The fact is, artificially cheap credit facilitated by the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, made possible a credit expansion that was channeled into the housing market. It made loans artificially cheap and easy to obtain. It artificially propped up housing prices, leading to the impression that the housing boom would continue forever. And of course, these kinds of bubbles fueled by monetary policy have to pop. And in 2008, it all came crashing down. This is why we are in this mess, and millions of innocent Americans are casualties of this. These Americans have the right to be outraged, but it's very important for them to be outraged about the right things. It's true that large institutions like Bank of America do not represent a free market economy and do not even closely resemble what similar institutions would look like in a free market. First of all, because of their cozy relationship with the federal government, they have been able to grow artificially large and set up barriers to entry to their competitors. In a free market, most banking institutions would be far, far smaller, and the largest ones would be much smaller than the largest banks are today. Indeed, circa 1980, the largest banking entity, at that time I believe it was Citigroup, was about a third the size of the largest bank today, and actually just today, the largest bank has become JP Morgan Chase, displacing Bank of America. So it's clear that there has been some artificial consolidation due to political favoritism being given to certain banking institutions. This is unacceptable and it needs to be protested. With any protest movement, as widespread as the Occupy movement has become, there are going to be different factions within that movement. Some factions are going to be more sympathetic than others. When someone holds up a poster saying, "End the Fed," or "Bring the troops home," I am 100% in agreement. I think those individuals have it right. The central bank has been an engine of rampant inflation, rampant economic distortion, stimulating malinvestment, and stimulating the redistribution of wealth to politically favored interests. This has to stop. It is harming tens and hundreds of millions of people throughout the Western world. And indeed, one could make a very plausible case that it is harming everyone except the 1% and then some. I think a lot of the raw emotional sentiment behind the protests is justified in the sense that individuals today in Western economies are being prevented from thriving on the basis of their own merit and their own hard work. Instead, their incomes, their earning potential, their economic opportunities are being artificially held down by a political system that sets up myriad barriers to entry into many, many occupations that individuals could just productively take up if they had the will and determination to do it. Instead, there are just a few officially sanctioned pathways for economic advancement that are left by federal government edict in the United States or the policies of national governments in Europe. And if one wants to advance economically, one essentially has to follow those established pathways. Go work for a corporation that donates enough money to enough politicians in order to be allowed to exist and perhaps get some special favors vis-a-vis its competitors. I understand the anger. And I think a sizable minority of the protesters actually know what they're talking about. That being said, with any movement of that size, there are going to be individuals who do not know how to properly channel their discontentment, and individuals who are simply philosophically confused and lash out at everything they conceivably associate with the status quo. I think this is not just true of the Occupy movement, it is also true of what many have called its mirror image on the right, the Tea Party movement, which, on the one hand, is made up of libertarians and fiscal conservatives, people who want to reduce the power of the federal government, people who want it to stay within its means, people who care about civil liberties, people who would like more individual autonomy. in everyday life, free from prohibitions and mandates. On the other hand, a lot of Tea Partiers are racists, xenophobes, religious bigots who want to impose their own very narrow parochial definition of the good life upon the rest of us. And some Tea Partiers are neoconservatives who would like to see the United States being involved in more and more foreign conflicts, despite the drainage that these foreign conflicts inflict on the US federal budget. I think the Occupy movement is likewise characterized by these different elements of varying degrees of rationality. The irrational elements of the movement are the ones that I would particularly want to criticize today. These are the people who say that we must smash capitalism, we must abolish the, quote, greed of the present system, the income inequality that allegedly plagues it, and they don't say this because they think the income inequality is somehow forced upon us, that it's artificial, that it's created by the political system. They don't look at it this deeply, I don't think. What they say is income inequality is bad per se. Greed is bad per se. Certain accumulations of wealth are bad per se. And this is where I must strongly disagree. Indeed, the system of capitalism, even though it was actually named by its detractors, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century, is a system of wealth accumulation, of the accumulation of resources to facilitate great enterprises that are capable of diffusing prosperity throughout the general population. What do you need to build a factory? What do you need to develop a new drug? What do you need to invent a new machine that can produce goods more effectively? You need a lot of time. You need a lot of hours of manpower, be it physical or mental, and you need something to pay for it all. You need some fund, very broadly defined, to sustain it all. That's what is called capital. And capitalism is a system that allows these funds of resources to be accumulated based on the economic forces of supply and demand. What do people in the market economy desire to have as goods and services? What goods and services are currently available? And how easy is it to procure them? That's the supply side of it. So the system of capitalism is a system where individuals can go out and acquire goods and stockpile resources in order to fulfill consumer demand on a free market where everyone has a choice. The producer has a choice in deciding what he or she will produce. The consumer has a choice in deciding what he or she will purchase. And ultimately, the consumer is the sovereign. As Milton Friedman, the late Chicago School economist, put it, the only true sovereignty is consumer sovereignty. If the consumer doesn't want a particular good, if the consumer isn't willing to pay a certain amount of money for it, then it will not be profitable to produce that good unless the profit is a psychic kind of profit, where the producer just does it for the pleasure of creating something. So with that being said, the capitalist economy has existed in various incarnations throughout human history. It has never been a perfect free market economy, and it is far from that today. But in the capitalistic elements, in the free market elements of the economy, we see a great engine of prosperity. And what my fear is regarding the Occupy movement is that it is going to influence enough politicians to try to further undermine that engine of prosperity through further command and control measures that try to centrally plan the economy in an attempt to reach some global abstract conception of equity or equality. In practice, that is highly detrimental. It is highly detrimental because of what Mises called the socialist calculation problem, the fact that a central planner cannot rationally know what the optimal allocation of resources is, because there are just too many resources, and without an efficient way to intercompare the relative values of the uses of those resources, there's no possible way to make sure that you're not wasting them, that you're not actually taking resources from a higher priority and devoting them to a lower priority and destroying value in doing so. In a truly free market, the price system serves that function of prioritizing the allocation of resources. However, if certain politicians mess with the price system by imposing, for instance, artificial barriers to entry into a business, or artificial prohibitions on what resources people may use, or, for instance, price floors, as with a minimum wage, then you have a distorted signal coming from the price system. The price system ceases to convey exactly what is the best way to prioritize among competing uses of goods. There is also the knowledge problem, articulated by Friedrich Hayek. Even if you had all of the technical know-how in terms of calculating what would be the best use of something, it's still the fact that all of this information about where particular goods are, who would make the best use of them, is scattered throughout humankind. No one person can gather the tremendous amounts of information in one place. Even if he knew what to do with it when he had it, the knowledge problem states that knowledge is dispersed, and individuals within the particular circumstances of time and place, even if they make mistakes, even if they have to try and fail over and over again, ultimately know better how to allocate these resources than some extremely competent and extremely benevolent central planner at the top. And to call a central planner extremely competent and extremely benevolent is a very generous assumption to make. So it is very, very alarming that federal politicians in the United States, Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi, have begun to use the Occupy movement as a way to advance their own political agendas. It's disturbing, first of all, because it seems like a grassroots movement that was born out of genuine indignation and genuine concern is being co-opted by politicians for their own cynical purposes. And I want nobody to be under the illusion that the Democratic Party somehow represents the average American or the person on the street any more than the Republican Party does. Both of these parties are indeed beholden to that very same politically connected elite that distorts the free market by lobbying for special privileges and purchasing the votes of politicians. If the Occupy movement is serious about the system that it's critiquing, then it cannot expect political action from the establishment to accomplish its goals. Indeed, it's quite odd to think that some of the powers that the Occupy movement seeks to expand are being used against the Occupy movement at this very instance. I have seen many disturbing accounts of police brutality against the protesters, and that, in my view, is inexcusable. Police have wantonly beaten protesters, sprayed them with pepper spray, arrested them in mass, often for pretend offenses, and these are agents of the same entities whose powers the protesters wish to expand. Clearly, by giving them more unbridled discretion, you are not going to curtail their abuses. Furthermore, I want to be even-handed in terms of the criticism I dispense with regard to conduct. So I will say that certain of the protesters have also not behaved themselves appropriately. For instance, a legitimate argument can be made that if one is on public property, because it's property that everybody pays for and everybody has the right to use, they have the right to be there and occupy that property and express their views. However, many protesters have camped out in private parks without the permission of the park's owners. And that, to me, is trespass. It is a violation of the property rights of those individuals who did not cause the economic crisis, by the way. They were not the entities that received bailouts. They're just trying to own and manage a park and earn a living doing so. Furthermore, some protesters have gone into bank branches, again private property, and tried to not just occupy them, but they engaged in disorderly conduct that scared away customers of those banks. Irrespective of whether those banks' actions during the economic crisis were legitimate, it's still the case that they own that property. And one cannot claim the moral high ground with regard to respecting property, with regard to respecting the rights of individuals to keep what they've earned, if one simultaneously violates the private property of others. In order to maintain that moral high ground, one has to be consistent and respect private property, even if one doesn't respect the possessor. Of course, I don't think that these are offenses that deserve being beaten or being run over with a police motorcycle or being put in jail. I think these legitimately should be civil offenses that should be accompanied by fines and attempts at restitution. Again, I think the protesters misunderstand what they should be targeting, and they insufficiently target the current criminal justice system. They insufficiently target what might be called the police state, the arbitrary system that facilitates their own detention and their own physical abuse at the hands of the police for disproportionate kinds of offenses. They should look into advocating for reforming the criminal justice system and increasing the emphasis on civil penalties for infractions, as well as restitution of the victim, rather than just punishing the offender on behalf of the society or the government and locking people up for many years at a time simply for breaching a law as a formality, even where there's no identifiable victim. Also, the protesters should really be targeting the outrageous violations of civil liberties at the hands of the Transportation Security Administration, which arrogates to itself the right to virtually strip search and or grope anyone who flies. It should be even more outraged at the arrogation of authority by the Obama administration to unilaterally assassinate American citizens living abroad without any sort of trial, without any sort of charges brought against them, on the say-so of a secret panel whom nobody is aware of in terms of its composition, whose criteria nobody is aware of, and whose secret list of American citizens to be assassinated nobody is aware of. After the assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, the United States drones now killed his young son. And it seemed pretty obvious at the time that this assassination was not just going to be a one-time use of this authority. The question at the back of my mind was, well, who is it going to be used on next now that the precedent has been established? And lo and behold, just a few days later, a young American citizen, younger than most of the protesters, was killed, not even as a direct target, but as, quote, collateral damage. This is appalling, and I think the protesters need to prioritize their targets. In general, the Occupy movement can be seen as an illustration of what happens when you have abuses within a political and economic system, but you don't have a culture that is philosophically ready to adequately respond to those abuses with proper policy countermeasures. In each of these cases, you have a spontaneous upswell of outrage. And this has happened not just in modern times. It is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a peculiar phenomenon to democratic societies or Western societies. It has happened as long as humans have recorded history. Peasant rebellions in the Middle Ages, slave revolts in ancient Rome have occurred time and time again. And yet, without an adequate philosophical understanding of what these individuals in the uprising were against and how they wanted to improve the world, each of these uprisings ultimately came to naught. Ultimately, either the old oppressive system was reestablished and strengthened, or the rebels succeeded and created their own form of oppression in its place, as, for instance, in the Soviet Union, after the workers and peasants of Russia rose up in protest against the abuses of the Tsarist regime. So it is extremely important to think, not just to go out in the streets and shout slogans and hold up signs, but to thoroughly deliberate. What is actually wrong? What are you really against? What are you supposed to be targeting that will actually help people, instead of just lashing out at everything, lashing out at wealth, lashing out at capitalism, lashing out at greed, which is universal among humans? It is important to make distinctions. It is important to take a moment to deliberate and figure out how best to proceed in a manner that will actually bring about a better world, a world where the current establishment will be neither fortified nor replaced with something worse.